University of Maastricht Erasmus Plus program on the reform of international investment law. I am Ivana Damjanovic, and today I am in Bonnefanten Museum in Maastricht, which is a home to old and contemporary art. The museum displays a number of Flemish, Dutch, Italian Renaissance masterpieces. Previously, we talked about international investment law and its interaction with legitimate public policy objectives. Of course, protection of cultural heritage is one such objective, and when we talk about culture, Europe takes a special place. Today we won't be looking at culture, but we will be considering investment in Europe, particularly investment protections and dispute settlement in the European Union. It's my great pleasure to discuss these topics today with Nicolas de Sadelaer, Professor of European Union Law.
Welcome, yes, Nicolas. It's a pleasure to be here with you in Maastricht.
So previously in our conversations we mentioned historical development of international investment law and relationship between developed and developing countries. How is this constellation of relations reflected in the European context?
The European context is about conclusion of bilateral treaties between Western capital exporting countries and Eastern capital importing countries.
So when were these treaties concluded?
Prior to the 1990s, Germany had been concluding only two agreements, one with Greece, the other one with Portugal. One had to wait the fall of the communist regimes in Central Europe in the beginning of the 1990s to see an interest in concluding bilateral treaties between, on the one hand, UK, Germany, and on the other hand, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania.
So it seems to me that the European Commission has been encouraging at that time member states to actually enter into these treaties. So how many treaties were concluded?
In fact, about 190 treaties were concluded between Western capital exporting nations and Central European countries, with a view to affording greater protection to the Western undertakings. In addition, in 1994, the Commission supported the conclusion of a multilateral treaty, the Energy Charter.
Okay, so what has changed, or why did the Commission change its position on these treaties later?
Well, 2004 was an important year because 10 countries from mostly Central Europe became member states of the European Union. In becoming member states, they were subject to the whole acquis communautaire. So they were subject in particular to the rules related to the functioning of the internal market.
So there is a potential of a conflict between these provisions in international investment treaties, these BITs, and internal market rules.
You're right. On the account that the fundamental treaties, the founding treaties, provide for the recognition of the freedom of establishment of undertakings in foreign countries, that's a member state. In addition, it enshrines the free movement of capitals, as well as the free movement of services. In addition, the EU legal order enshrines the right to property and enshrines also the legitimate expectation of undertakings.
So the Commission then encouraged member states to terminate these BITs, but things didn't go very easy.
Not at all, because Western nations wanted to maintain these treaties on the account that they were conferring substantive and procedural rights to their undertakings, whereas on the other hand, Central European countries that were respondent before these arbitral tribunals were on a very defensive stance.
So, because there was no political consensus, things of course had to be resolved by the Court of Justice of the European Union, and that leads us to the landmark judgment of Achmea.
In Achmea, the Court of Justice had to adjudicate whether the treaty concluded between the Netherlands and Slovakia was consistent with the EU legal order. The Court of Justice reached a conclusion that such a treaty was inconsistent. And this is a landmark judgment because it meant that all the other bilateral treaties were also inconsistent with the EU legal order.
Consequence of Achmea, does it mean that arbitration under any of the intra-EU BITs is actually illegal under EU law?
That's correct, because these bilateral investment treaties undermine the autonomy of the EU legal order.
But why did the court come with such a shocking decision, and what do you mean by the autonomy of the EU legal order?
I won't call that a shocking decision. It sounds music to my ears. One has to bear in mind that the Court of Justice of the European Union is the only interpreter of EU law. The court was thus afraid that investment tribunals could interpret and apply EU law, whereas the Court of Justice was the only one to do that job.
Well, it was a shocking decision for investment arbitration community, if you like, because on the one hand, investment tribunals do not interpret and apply EU law, they interpret and apply international law. And on the other hand, there are all these national courts within the EU that every day apply EU law.
I would like to raise two issues. First issues, the treaty concluded between the Netherlands and Slovakia allowed the tribunal to apply domestic law, and domestic law for the member states encompasses EU law. A second issue is that the Court of Justice reached a conclusion that there was a risk of interferences between the rights conferred to the investors and the obligations stemming from the EU legal order.
So that the Court of Justice said that these investment tribunals are not the courts of member states.
Yes, indeed, the Court of Justice underscored that the investment tribunals were not elements of the EU judicial system. The EU judicial system reckons upon the thousands of domestic courts that contribute to the case law of the Court of Justice of the European Union.
So how is then consistency ensured in respect to EU law among all these courts in the EU?
The founding treaties provide for a cooperation judicial mechanism allowing or obliging domestic courts to refer questions to the Court of Justice whenever there is a doubt about the validity or the interpretation to be given to provisions of EU law.
So basically, because investment tribunals are not domestic courts, they do not have the availability of the same mechanism. They cannot refer questions for preliminary ruling to the Court of Justice. Why did the court find a problem with investment arbitration and not commercial arbitration?
First, the Court of Justice has been underscoring that the awards are subject to limited review by ordinary court. Second, the judicial EU system is based upon mutual trust between the different national courts.
So although this review is limited in commercial arbitration, it still gives a certain level of control to the Court of Justice of the European Union over the interpretation of EU law.
Yes, although in commercial arbitration the review is limited, one can expect it that ordinary court reviewing the award might refer questions for preliminary rulings to the Court of Justice of the European Union. It seems to me that's much more difficult with respect to awards handed down by arbitral tribunal.
Unless, of course, these awards are subject to UNCITRAL rules and the New York Convention on the recognition and enforcement of awards. And this exactly happened in Komstroy.
Yes, indeed. The Court of Appeal of Paris has been referring questions regarding the concept of investment under the Energy Charter. And so there was a review of the award handed down by the arbitral tribunal by the Court of Appeal, which referred the questions to the Court of Justice.
So coming back to the issue of mutual trust, why is it so important in the context of the EU?
In fact, the domestic court have to apply EU law, and they do it on a daily basis. So investors from Germany or from France must trust the Polish court that they will apply correctly the internal market rules.
So there is no place for second-class justice in the EU. So what does this mean for investors in practice?
A German investor investing in Poland, for instance, has to submit its claim before a Polish court, and the Polish court has to be adjudicate the dispute under EU law in applying correctly, consistently with the case law of the Court of Justice, the EU provisions.
Well, we know that investment tribunals have reached a number of awards in these intra-EU arbitrations, even after Achmea. What does that mean for investors? Will they be able to enforce these awards in the EU?
In case the investor has been winning its case against the respondent states and the investor wants to enforce its award before a domestic court, the domestic court is called upon to abide by the case law of the Court of Justice. Therefore, the domestic court cannot enforce the award.
So obviously Achmea judgment has opened a number of issues. In a way, it has led to a full clash between EU legal order and international investment arbitration. Also because investment tribunals have continued claiming that they still have jurisdiction to decide these disputes, that there is no inconsistency between EU legal order and international investment law in the intra-EU context. Of course, there are practical issues of enforcement for investors and so on. Do we see end of this saga?
Fair enough. Many tribunals disagreed with the case law of the Court of Justice. For that reason, member states have been concluding an inter se agreement with a view to terminating the BITs that have been concluded in the past.
So that resolves the issue of BITs, but what about the Energy Charter Treaty?
Well, as we already mentioned earlier in the interview, the Court of Justice in Komstroy ruled that the ISDS mechanism provided for under the Energy Charter is inconsistent with the autonomy of EU legal order.
And of course, modernized ECT, if it ever comes to its realization, will fully clarify that intra-EU disputes in the EU context.
Yes, this one doesn't know whether this modernization treaty will ever enter into force, and then the question is whether this is going to be sufficient to make this ECT compatible with the EU legal order.
But we could say that in a way this has all started the end game for ISDS in the EU.
I fully agree with you.
Thank you, Nicolas de Sadelaer. There are many more controversies that we could discuss today, but we have come to the end of this interview. And thank you, dear viewers, for your attention.